Good morning, everyone. Um, Today, we're lucky to have Adam Hinson to share on this topic. Um, so, Adam is currently pursuing a PhD in mechanical engineering at Virginia Tech. His focuses are in bioinspiration robotics, deep learning, reinforcement learning, signal processing, and acoustics. His research uses deep reinforcement learning on tendon actuators to study the effect of bat pinna motion on echoes. Adam is currently under the tutelage of Professor Rolf Miller, who is an expert in this field. So Adam is in good hands and learning from some of the world's best. Now I'm going to pass the time to Adam for him to present his presentation to us, and then we will have our conversation after. Adam, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so as you said, my name's Adam. Of course, I work under Dr. Mueller, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction on kind of what our work as an overview is, a little bit more focus on what I do and everything we do involving bats, where you can, of course, see the big one right here. And so what's so fascinating about the bats? This is a horseshoe bat right here. This is specifically what I and my work has most focused on. Why we chose them, you'd have to go back and talk to Dr. Mueller about that. His whole lab has been bat-based since the beginning, and that's just what he loves and what he enjoys studying. And they're really fascinating. And I think obviously the first thing that comes to mind when people think about bats, and something that most of us probably know, is a lot of their perception of the world is based on sound. Not a lot of it is based on their vision. Some people do believe, or there's always been that myth that they're blind. That's not exactly true. They do have vision. It's not their prominent source. You can take them, you can blindfold them. And in some cases, they've even been found that blindfolded, they perform better in their movements and moving around. And so the big thing, he mentioned pinnae there and the movement on that. That is the ears. That's these giant ears is, one of the first things you notice when you look at these bats, and they're super unique in that they have 20 muscles within each ear. And so they're very movable. They can twitch them in all different ways. And then they also, of course, you see this nose down here, which is also pretty unique looking, which they call the nose leaf. And that is where the sound and that chirp that the bat sends out is actually emitted. So, and they also have the ability to actuate that and fold it in and move it to change the way they send out the signal and change the direction of the signal. And so those are two of the really interesting features of these bats that we're looking at. And so right here is just a little bit of our robotic project. So our lab as a whole works in kind of two different routes. We're interested in that sonar side of the bat, and I'll talk a lot more about that because that's personally what I work on. And there's some interesting, cool little designs on the left. Those are a few different iterations of some of the models we've worked on. We work really, the graduate students help, but of course we have undergrads and senior design teams that work on and iterate these robots. And there's some really cool models down there that they've made. And then on the right is the other side, which I don't work with as much, but it's the flight side, because these bats, as well as being incredible with their sonar capabilities, they're very great at flying, moving around, making incredible turns and quick movements that a lot of other creatures aren't able to make. And so this is another thing that they've studied and tried to mimic that with the robot. And of course, the far down the line plan is, how do we take these two systems, bring them together, and make one incredible bat robot? But of course, with weight constraints, that's very far down the line. So really quickly, this is the another side of it, whereas, it's bioinspiration. We want to learn from these bats. How do we do that? So this is at the University of Brunei, Jerusalem, and they've set up this awesome tunnel with a bunch of high-speed cameras. This is them in the middle of construction of it. I think that might be the summer before last, working on it and setting it up. And what they would do is let the bats fly through this tunnel, image them, take analysis on that, figure out what kind of movements they make, what kind of sounds they make, and all the different incredible maneuvers that they can make. And then going more into what I do myself is, so it's cool. They can map, they can look at with their nose, they can look with their sound, but how are they doing that, and what do we do with that? So one of the big projects I've worked on is being able to localize yourself in a forest. So you think of a forest, a bunch of trees, it's really hard to tell where you are. Maybe GPS doesn't work as well. Maybe other sources of navigation are struggling out there. But these bats can fly around those forests. You put them in a forest once and they instantly know how to get back where they came from just using their ears. They know where they've lived, they know where to hunt, they know how to pick a moth out 10 meters away. And so our idea is using this with a system that has a speaker that emits one of those ultrasonic chirps, hears back the echoes, and then as we're doing that, we're mapping out the forest, taking in GPS values of where we actually are, and making clusters out of those. So we take those GPS values and kind of sort them by locality, and then we use those associating echoes to train a deep neural network to try to learn from those echoes, how do we localize ourselves in the environment, similar to what must be going on in the bats' brains and what we assume. Next slide. And then, yeah, I just want to quickly also show you these tendon actuation systems. So this goes a little bit further into more of one of my other projects, which is we have these tendons that we can move and actuate and try to make them mimic what the bats do. So you see the tendon actuators on the left, and then a couple examples of them actually on the right. And what I'm trying to do with that is take them and perform a reinforcement learning problem. So if you're familiar with reinforcement learning, you're trying to train it based on, oh, that made a good movement, I'm going to give it a positive reward. I don't like that, maybe I'll give it a negative reward. And we want to figure out what is the best pattern that these ears can actuate and make in order to pull the most information from this environment, whether our challenge is localization, detecting an object, or anything else like that. And also, what is the best way to align and create these ears and tendon actuation. And that's it for kind of introducing the work in general.
Exciting stuff, Adam. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's amazing what you guys are doing over there, both at Blacksburg, Virginia Tech University, and also here at Brunei Darussalam University. So, yeah, I've got a few questions for you, but before we dive into them, I'm interested to know what actually piqued your initial interest to enter this field, like, bioinspiration field.
Yeah, so biology has always been something I'm interested in. I'm a mechanical engineer first and foremost, is what it says on there, but really the reason I got into mechanical engineering is because I couldn't decide. So mechanical engineering lets you do a bunch of different stuff, and I've always loved the biology world. My secondary was biomedical engineering. That was something I was interested in, and that's initially what I worked in with my graduate studies. I was over there working with bacteria and just figured it didn't quite work for me, and I found Dr. Mueller's lab through his course. And I've always been super interested in nature and, watching nature documentaries, going out and looking at animals, seeing how they move, seeing what they do. And I just think there's so much out there that we can learn from them and understand from them. And especially in the engineering world where we're trying to design new things.
So that's where you marry both discipline and fields to see what kind of innovation you can build from there, right?
Of course.
So how big is this field? In terms of, like in the academic world, is it a popular field right now? And how big is this research literature community in the world's context?
In just the field of bio-inspired engineering, biomimicry, this is something that is gigantic. I think it's going on where people don't even know it's going on. They don't even know that they're taking stuff from nature. You just think about a plane. A plane is just a bird at the end of the day. Like, that's where they get these ideas. You go back to Da Vinci and his drawings. All of his drawings were, these bird-inspired wings and these great nature-inspired machines that, of course, he never realized, but things that have come up later in gliders and incredible different things that were built. And the field is just gigantic. Especially, you look at that reinforcement learning field that I talked about. Locomotion is huge in that field, and it's super interesting. They're looking at all different kind of animals. The really famous one, of course, is that gosh, I'm forgetting the name. Is it Spot? Is that the robot? Off the top of my head, the quadrupedic robot that looks kind of like a dog. And they're inspired by, like I just said, dogs, basically, to come up with that design versus anything else. You look at kangaroo inspired robotics, there's so much in locomotion field. And that's kind of what has set ours apart a little bit, is when you're using that reinforcement learning, most people are trying to mimic some kind of movement and achieve that task, versus we're in this more sensing field of trying to mimic how these animals perceive their environment with a different method that we can't comprehend.
Right. Right. Got it. So, as you understand, in your understanding, are there a lot of startups in the US working in this field as well?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a popular field
Uh,
for the
I'm not
startups
as
scene? Yep.
yeah. I'm not as familiar with the startup field, of course. I'm much more retained in the academic world, but I think
Right.
it's like I said, I think these solutions come up out of nowhere
Hmm.
where, and that really goes into one of the things I was thinking about talking about, which is there's really two approaches that come into this biomimicry, biomimetics, bio-inspired engineering, whatever word you want to use. Some people say
Hmm.
they're different. I think they just all mean the same thing,
Hmm.
which is there's solution based and then there's also problem based. So you may start with the problem.
Right.
You look over in Japan, one of the most interesting and most known biomimicry approaches was the bullet train,
Right.
where this
Okay.
bullet train that's super fast going through these tunnels, but when it goes through the tunnels, you get this giant sonic boom of all this air that builds up on the front. And so
Hmm.
you got this issue going on. And then this engineer that's leading on the project is out at the park one day watching a kingfisher dive
Hmm.
into the water to attack its prey.
Hmm.
And the second it hits the water, no splash, no nothing like that. And so they
Hmm.
start looking at the beak and they start looking at how it
Hmm.
worked.
Hmm.
And they end up taking that inspiration and moving it into the actual train. So there's just, you know, even if you're not, it's kind of that weird. It's like, how many people are actually, I'm going to start a bio-inspired engineering company. I don't think
Right.
that's the initial goal, but I
Right.
think you get into a field and then you start finding it. And then, like I said, the other idea or the other one is solution based, where you find it in nature and then you try to come
Hmm.
up with, okay, well, what can I solve with this? And that really
Right.
great example of that is Velcro, which
Right.
if you're familiar with how that came up, is there was a I don't know how far back it
Ge-
was, but there was a
Gecko, is it?
scientist. Velcro.
Yep. Um, came from the inspiration of the gecko's uh what do you call that?
Really?
Like a web, is it? Or no? Am I thinking of
I
a
hadn't heard
different
about
story?
this. Very possible
Hmm.
that's something as well. But the burrs that you find out in the woods, like the little things with the pricklies that stick on to you.
Oh, right. Okay.
So or like you walk through something and you look on your pant legs. But there was
Hmm.
this scientist went out in the woods walking with his dog, and he comes
Hmm.
back and his dog's just covered in these burrs, and he got very
Right.
interested in like, why are these burrs attaching to my dog? Gets them under a microscope, starts working with them, and then eventually he comes up with the idea for Velcro.
Right. I see. Okay. Super interesting. So
Mhm.
you mentioned applying reinforcement learning in your work. So do you think that especially right now, with the whole advancement of AI and the hype, in the marketplace, as well in the research, I mean, but of course in the research domain, it's not a hype, it's a real, like a R&D going on there. Do you think that the advancement of AI helps in your field for better observation, analysis, even experimentation, like in your work?
Oh, of course. I mean, I think it's hard to look out there and find a field where AI isn't improving and
Mm,
moving on with. And I mean, specifically my work is machine learning, it is
mm,
reinforcement learning, deep neural networks. So when that field improves, it's always going to be improving my research. I mean, 10 years ago, they weren't doing that in this lab. This was beam forming and very difficult signal processing calculations
mm,
and hard, difficult math. And
mm.
now it's, here's this gigantic network that can solve all these equations for you with just throwing it in there. And you may not even know anything about acoustics, which of course we do try to keep our acoustics knowledge up to
Right.
date. But these neural networks can solve those problems for you without you even knowing what's going on. And then you
Mm,
can solve even more complex problems without understanding. I mean, you look at some of these pictures that are performed with these echoes, because you take the echo and you get a spectrogram out of it.
mm.
And I mean, you look at the spectrogram and you have no clue what's going on there, but
Yep.
then you give it to the neural network and it finds patterns that you may not be able to find in the data.
Mm, mm. I see. Now, before we dive in deeper, could you enlighten the audience and myself even, like if there's any distinctive differences between biomimicry and biomimesis and bioinspiration approaches for understanding how living organisms work and how you're actually using this knowledge to meet, the demand of innovative engineering.
Um, I'm not sure I'm following you. Could you?
So the question is like, do you think there's any differences between biomimicry and biomimesis and bioinspiration approaches? Like, yeah, like distinctive
Compared to
different,
the other,
yeah, like compared to
compared to
with
like
one
prototyping or just
among
like
one
other
another, or
methods?
no,
Oh,
among
among each
each
other.
other,
Yeah,
correct? Or
each
do they?
other.
Yep.
It personally, it depends on who you talk to. If you really
Mm,
go into the weeds of it, and the people that are in this field, they'll have a different definition for biomimicry and a different definition for bio-inspired engineering.
mm,
At the end of the day, I really think it's all the same thing. We're all
mm.
looking at nature, trying to learn from it and come
Right,
up with solutions to other problems that we have in the world.
right. So that's the core of it. Got it.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So since it's bio-inspired, then how do you deal with the challenges like um, in the design and in the designing and manufacturing of this new materials to replicate the uh, like the forms and function of this
Mm-hmm.
animals or organisms that are being studied. So, for instance, like you're studying the bat's ears, right? Like so,
Mm-hmm.
like what are some of the challenges that you think not just yourself but the whole in the field may face when they're working on this area that you can share with us?
Yeah, that's definitely a huge challenge when it comes into it. I mean, the materials that we find in nature are, and especially in these animals, are super hard to replicate.
Mm,
As it is not my side of it, but I know the flight team, one of the
mm,
biggest difficulties they've had is what do you make those wings out of? Because there's this super
mm,
unique
mm.
membrane that these bat wings are made of. If you've ever seen a picture of them, and they're
Yep,
super thin, but
yep.
they pick up all this air, and trying to make something like that has been really difficult. And then, like
Mm,
you said, with the bat ears too, it's really hard to mimic that.
mm,
And of course, the biggest difficulty when you come into mimicking nature is just the scale, where
yep.
we're trying to make, you see the size of our tendons, but
Mm,
a muscle in an actual species is tiny as can be.
mm,
So being able to actually mimic those things is so difficult. So you do run into a lot of challenges, and we utilize all kind of different things. All of our work is done with silicon, so it's actually this molding material
like 3D
that I
printing.
no, it's actually this. It's hard to describe it. It's like what they would use in like movies to make like prosthetic
Ah,
masks and
right,
stuff like
right.
that. Like it's that kind of
Mm,
material. Like
I
when you look on
see.
the bottle, it shows people making like goblin faces and
Yep,
stuff
yep,
like
yep.
that to wear in movies, and that's actually what we use on the ears. So you kind of have to get creative and look out there for different interesting
Mm,
materials,
mm,
and of course that can also be bio inspired.
mm,
There's tons of material science related research where people are looking into that kind of stuff, but also armor. Armor is a big thing where you go
mm,
out in the environment and you look at bugs. Bugs
mm.
are just one giant shell of armor. So
That's right.
what are they using? How does that structure work? What makes them strong? Shells, turtles,
Mm,
anything like that. There's so many interesting materials out there that we can also look to for inspiration.
right, right. And usually, what are the costs looking like when you're, you know, coming out with this materials, trying to build them yourself before you could actually, scale in production for that for commercial purposes. But in the early days, I mean, are they usually very expensive?
The financial cost of the materials we're using,
Mm, mm,
I honestly don't think they're at least the stuff we're using is not too expensive. Of course, I mean, we utilize all kinds of methods for things in our lab.
mm,
With the ears, like I said, we're using that. I mean, we use
mm,
3D printing for most of our stuff we put on these robots
mm.
that I've shown. We always go out to manufacturers too and try to get parts done, but we really try to do it, of course, being at the collegiate level, and with having senior design teams building a lot of these robots, you're trying to go as cheap as possible. I mean, you're making
Yep,
the robot for 2 grand or less. So
yep.
how do we do that? What can we
Mm,
use, and what do we have to work with? Really, the materials are one of the lower cost we have.
mm. Yep. Obviously, you have to start thinking about them from day one. Otherwise, even
Of
you've got the
course.
most advanced technology, if you can't, push it, to the commercial market, it can't be, commerciable, then what's the point, right? I mean, then who's going to forever fund this kind of research, you know? So, right. Okay. Now, do you face any challenges in when you're trying to get all this information from the bio creatures or organism? So in other words, is it easy for you to extract or obtain the biological information of the subjects that you're studying? Like,
I don't have a lot of experience in that part. I unfortunately have not been able to make the trip out to Brunei and do that work. Like I said, in my past, I've done biological work. I've worked with bacteria. Anybody that's done biological work knows it's very difficult and it's very time consuming because you're on the biology schedule. You have to wait for them to do what you want them to do. You can't just command them and get them to do exactly what you want, like you can with a program, where I know sometimes it can feel like you can't get your program to do what you want it to, but even more so with these animals because they have their own goals, their own needs, their own wants, and you have to really, it becomes very difficult to work with them. And I think going into that, a lot of you have to understand them just in so many different ways, because it's not only let me just watch and see what the animal does. You have to understand the why. So, well, that's cool that the animal did it, but why did they do that? We have to understand the constraints of the species, where there's a lot of different constraints that can come into play based on the ecology. I mean, that's a huge part of it is, okay, what kind of environment do they live in and what is causing them to do that? Because they may have developed it for a different reason than you. And I mean, maybe you can find a new use for it. There's just a bunch of huge constraints that go into that. For example, insects are a very interesting example. You know, a lot of people, you know, you see the horror movies of the 70s and you've got 50-foot tall insects, but that's just not possible because they have these very intricate vascular cardiovascular systems of how, or no, sorry about that, ventilation systems within their body of how they breathe. And it's all diffusion based, where our oxygen air comes in and comes out and it's fine. It all works, but theirs just flows through their body. And that's how they have pipes through their body basically to bring in air. And you can't scale that up because diffusion just doesn't work at a higher scale. So there's all these different interesting limitations you can find in the natural world. And you also have to understand what their goal is. Like we talked about with the bats, their ears, fantastic. Their acoustics and all that stuff is fantastic. But if you go to a bat and you try to learn from its eyes, you're not going to learn much because that's not what they're made for. And then vice versa for something like an eagle, where they have the most highly developed eye systems of most creatures out there. But if you were to look at their ears, you probably wouldn't get much information out of it.
So do you face issue where when you're studying a single species but because it's, you know, you can find them in different ecological environment, that they actually to have different characteristics or behaviors in different, you know, like in different places? So then how do you go about in the study? Does it make it easier or more challenging?
Or
it's you learn new things?
Of course. It's always going to make it challenging, but it makes it more interesting as well. And the fact that not only is there variation from species to species, there's interspecies variation. And I mean, without that, we wouldn't have all the species to study from. So it's good we have that. But at the same time, you know, there can be difficulties where it can be the weirdest things. Like out in Japan, there's this species of monkey, which has developed the desire to go basically like sit in the hot waters and bathe. Versus like in the same species elsewhere, nowhere else would try to do that. And it's just they learn new behaviors based on where they are. So there is that challenge, and that just goes back into the ecology and how do we know what's actually, you know, it's not enough to know what they do. You have to know why they do it and what caused them to do it and what's the importance of it.
Got it. Now let's switch to the, you know, opportunities. We've been talking a lot about the challenges. Now, what are some of the other form of benefits that you can think of apart from the innovation and commercial benefits that bioinspiration can bring?
The the biggest real thing that you find with bioinspiration and
Mm,
why it's so useful and so interesting is it's just ahead of the game with every other method out there. So,
right.
you can really think at the beginning, there's, analytic math. You can sit there, you can
Mm,
write equations trying to define stuff. You can prototype stuff and try to test it. You can simulate stuff. But biological evolution has been around for billions and billions of years,
mm,
and that's basically billions of years of R&D. That is
mm,
all natural selection is. That is all evolution is at the end of the day is R&D. It's, well, let's try this and see if it works. And when it doesn't work, we don't continue, but the species doesn't get passed on. The genetics don't get passed. That's the whole idea of being a species is evolution is we want to pass on our genes to the next series and the next group. But if you don't have a good design, you don't do that. And that's the
mm.
same way. I mean, you look at something like a genetic algorithm that we use day
Yep.
to day,
Yep.
or that is used in the machine world. That comes from nature. That is a bio-inspired system, is the
Mm,
idea of the
mm.
genetic algorithm.
Yep.
And I mean, evolution is vastly more expensive than anything we can do in engineering. Evolution is 3.7 billion years of work and plus
Mm,
that, and it's an optimization process. There's a deterministic component, which is natural selection. That's, we know what's going to happen. The best species is probably going to go off, but there's also that random component. So you don't
mm,
get stuck in one design because you have mutation. Something comes out different, mutated. Maybe it works better, maybe it doesn't. And so you get this whole development that is mimicked, that is done in nature, which creates all these unique, incredible designs that have come up to solve even some of the most difficult and challenging environments. But
mm,
also, I mean, that alone, like I said, inspires us with genetic algorithms, neural networks. All of this
mm,
is inspired from nature.
mm. I've recently come across the concept of fractal analysis, and um, in fact, I've learned that there are some AI researchers been using it in their data science work. Do you also use this in your work? Like,
I'm not as familiar with fractal analysis. I haven't
mm,
really dug into that, so no, I haven't used it yet
mhm.
in my work. But
Okay,
definitely something interesting to look into.
right, right, okay. Um, well, we've got a question that just popped up from the window. By the way, if anyone who's listening and watching, whether from directly in a Zoom webinar room or from our Facebook Live, please feel free to ask us to throw us any question our way. And if you're watching from Facebook Live, you want to ask anonymously, just join in our Zoom right now, and then yeah, you can post them anonymously. So, what are some of the current challenges in developing and optimizing biomimetic bat sonar robots with deep learning capabilities?
So
Yep.
yeah, more specific to what I'm working on for sure.
Mm,
Really the challenges are getting data from the environment is really hard. So as I talked about, being one of my main projects is being able to localize yourself in a forest. But
mm,
those forest environments are so complex. I mean, you're getting thousands and thousands of echoes back from
mm,
every single little leaf out there is catching a little bit of the sound and bouncing it back at you, and you're having to read in and process that. And so what
mm,
really comes into that is these networks have to be really intelligent to be able to pick out these patterns.
mm,
So there definitely is the restraint of where are we in the machine learning world, where are we in the neural network world. And as more algorithms come out, of course our work's only going to get better.
mm,
We're in that world, but we're not in the world of developing algorithms. We're not coming up with new stuff,
mm,
new ideas in that realm. We're application based. So we're trying to figure out how to use that to better our work. And so we're a little limited in waiting for new stuff to come out and new interesting things to come out. Of course, as I talked about, the fusion of the robotics, the flying
mm,
and the sonar, you're really limited by size and
mm.
processing power and making things smaller and smaller to be able to get off the ground. And oh, geez, I had another thought, but it's slipping my mind now.
No
But
worries.
yeah, the
Maybe
big the big limitation, yeah, definitely
mm,
comes with the networks and the use of those.
right. And what are some of, and there's actually a follow-up question here. What is there any ongoing research efforts to overcome these challenges?
Of course, yeah. It's the neural network world. There's a bunch of people that are working on those problems and trying to create better networks, faster networks, more intelligent networks. And of course, one of the hardest challenges was with that is the smarter the networks get, it feels like the less you know about what's going on. So you
Mm,
kind of have to have that balance of still understanding. It's not enough to just plug the network, let it solve the problem, and go, okay, that works, it's fine. You kind of
mm,
you need to still understand what's going on there, what's coming out of the environment, because you have to understand the limitations of these devices and what they can and can't do.
mm. Okay. Um, we've got another question. What are the ethical considerations of developing robots that mimic animal senses and behaviors?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic questions. I think anytime you work with the biological world, you really have to think about those ethical considerations.
Mm,
And I would say in the actual development of something that mimics an animal or a species, I don't really feel like there's a huge moral concern there. It's not like they have a copyright or anything on what they do.
mm, mm,
It's very it's out there for us to take from and always be taken from. I think the biggest thing you have to look to is respecting those species, like what we're doing research on the bats, so we have to go out there, we have to collect the bats, and we have to get data on them, but we also don't want to harm them, we don't want to upset the ecosystem as we're working on that. And that all goes into the ethical practices that come with anything
mm,
biologically based research where you're using living beings, and you
mm,
have to understand what the moral implications of that are. And I think it's even, as far as just doing the inspiration work, I think it's actually, I think there's a lot of good to it, of course, but you get a better respect for what these animals can do. You get a better respect for nature. You see the importance of biodiversity, because if there's not biodiversity out there, we're not going to have all these incredible, wonderful designs. And I think you gain more respect for the species by
mm.
doing work on them.
Now, since you're studying bats, I believe you guys are capturing them from the
Mhm.
wild, right? So, do you face what are some of these challenges then, like capturing wild bats?
Yeah, like I said, I'm not as experienced on that side. I haven't made that trip.
Hmm.
Hopefully, I get to eventually, but I know just from talking with the people that have been there, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to go out there and catch the bats. It's difficult to work with them and get them to do what you want to do. Like I said, you don't have control over these animals. These animals
Mm,
are going to do what they want to. So when you
mm,
release them to fly through the tunnel, you don't know. They might just turn around and fly off and do whatever they want and act
mm.
crazy. So you kind of have to get people that really know what they're doing, and that's something we do. We don't have a bunch of engineers out there
Yeah.
handling bats and running around with them. We get very intelligent, trained people that are way more qualified than us to do that work.
Mm,
That are biologists that work with these animals for their career and their research, so they can come out there and do those practices. A big step we've made recently is it used to be we would take the bats, I know, and take them back, keep them for a while,
mm.
feed them, keep them healthy, but also use them for experiments. And now what they've gone is they do, at least I think last summer, their first time was they would do catch and release in one day. So they would catch the bats,
Right.
take them, do the experiments on them, and at the end of the day, take them back. So they never spend time just living in the facilities or anything like
Mm,
that. So that's also been a huge improvement and been a lot more, um, you know, good to the bats for sure.
mm. And in this field, how usually do uh, the researchers deal with the livelihood of such animals? Like, what are there any high death rates of the animals while they're being studied?
Um, Not that I'm particularly familiar with. Of course, this all
Mm,
goes into the you can look up the codes based on where you work, where you live. Of course, there's some in the US, but I'm sure there's some there as well, and all these different practices that you have to follow and approvals
mm,
you have to go through. So it is a time consuming but necessary process, because I'm sure in the past there were issues where people were not properly using these animals and treating these animals when they did the experiments on them. So now there's a lot of legislation in place on how you're actually supposed to handle them and what you're supposed to do with them. And so that is pretty much crushed a lot of that issues that came with some of the less ethical practices that may have been around in the past.
mm.
But of course, that's something that just continues to get worked on more and more. And of course, in like not in my current work, but like I said in my previous work, we used to do a lot of bacteria work, and so it was for cancer treatment. And so what most of the field is, and one of the reasons I didn't really like the field is I never had to do it, but a lot of the work is mice. So
Yep.
you have to end up giving cancer to a mice, treating on it, and figuring out how to work it. So one of the really interesting fields that's being worked on is trying to make materials that mimic the mice, so that you don't have to do that. They're these biological mimicry materials that act just like the mice's tissue would, the mice's collagen would, and you try to create substitutes that you can test on rather than going to that nature world. And the biggest thing you have to know there is, and a big part of that is being 100% sure that the next step, the necessary step, is to go to the animal experimentation. If there's a way to do it without that, then of course you want to go that route. But sometimes it is of course done, especially in that field I used to be in, for the greater good is the expectation.
So if we can mimic the mice, can't we mimic something else? Especially if we're trying to research on, let's say, the application is to treat certain human parts. Can't we just mimic, let's say, an arm? And if we do, and what are the, again, like the ethical consideration of that, like, because we're not really using an arm, but like if, let's say, if we can clone, or manufacture a clone, a poultry meat, like it's grown from the lab. So what are some of the ethical considerations when, if we do the same thing for an arm tissue, and then we clone like the arm muscles and the tissue, and then we do experiment on that? What are your thoughts that you know?
Yeah, that's a whole new world that I am pretty far out of right now. But there's definitely, I'm sure there's work out there for that. Obviously, like I said, with the mice thing, they're not there yet. They're getting better about doing it, but they're still not at the point where they can completely mimic that structure and do the exact same thing that they want to. So of course that's something that they're still working on, and I'm sure hundreds of years down the line that's probably something that they'll be able to do, maybe even sooner than that.
So there's one question I think it could be a good flow to get into this. How can we ensure that the biomimetic robots are used responsibly and for the benefits of society?
Yeah, that's a absolutely loaded question. I think as an engineer, it's always going to be your responsibility to have an understanding of what this is going to be used for. And I think you have to be forward looking as well, where you can't just go, well, I'm building this for this purpose right now, so that's all it's ever going to be used for. You have to understand that with any device, anything you build, it's not just the biomimicry field, it's all of engineering. You have to understand that it's going to be used for something else eventually. Somebody's going to come up with a new idea for how to use it. So you kind of have to have a little bit of forward thinking there about what you're doing. But it's a difficult task. It's not one that's been solved, and it's going to continue to be difficult for any field out there to make sure that what they're doing is not going to be abused later.
Next question here is, what are the potential impacts of biomimetic robots on the environment and the ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really just depends on the robot. I mean, of course, you have the normal environmental and ecosystem impacts that come with just any sort of development of a product or anything like that are going to be out there. So you have to be wary of those. As far as exclusive to biomimetic robots, I don't think you're going to see as huge of an impact. I don't think, we make a working bat robot. I don't think we're going to get rid of the bats out there. I don't think that's really the end goal. Of course. But there's definitely, you have to think about that. That goes with what I was saying. You really have to forward think about what could come out of this. But I think most of the impacts that would be coming from a biomimetic robot are pretty close to what you would get from a normal robot.
Okay. So I
think
sorry,
if I could just go off that, I think there's even a lot of potential in that field to maybe have a positive effect on the environment or ecosystem. So I mean, you could think about, like, I'm not as familiar with this field or what's being done, but you think about bees, we're having issues with the bee populations and pollination going away. So what if you can make robots that are assisting the bees and keeping them alive and protecting them and stuff like that? So I think there's even a lot of positive routes that can come from it as well.
Right, right. And based on that, I mean, just to follow on to that point, there's even studies or work done on mosquitoes, right? Where they're trying to, instead of getting it to spread, to prevent the spread of malaria, so they're trying to, put like some good, I don't know, like antigens in the body so that they could, spread the good part of it around. I mean, it can also be used in that sense for the better good, right? That's what you're
Of
saying.
course, yeah, that goes into a lot of like bioengineering and stuff like that. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there with that.
Okay. So this question is rather interesting. By the way, a lot of good questions from the audience. Please keep them flowing in, coming in, whatever you have, just, yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, we haven't gotten a lot of time. So, whatever remaining time we have with Adam, so hopefully he can enlighten us on all these questions. So can the biological animal be mimicked at 100%? If not, what's the sort of like highest possible percentage of the mimicry can be achieved? Like, what are the benchmark that is the best industrial benchmark of, that has been practiced, and say like, oh, okay, we can't, mimic this at 100%, but maybe, yeah, 20%, 30%, that's good enough. And then let's commercialize this and blah, 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 those kind of things.
Of course, yeah. It's definitely really hard to put a percent number on it. I think it really depends on what you're trying to mimic. It depends on what you're trying to look at. A lot of these aren't, we're not sitting there trying to just, oh, how do we completely make a bat? Like, let's remake a bat. We're trying to take those important things from the bat, like that sonar, like that gliding ability, and mimic that. So being able to mimic certain parts of the animal, that's definitely something that's achievable. Being able to mimic them 100%, that's I can't think of a real example out there where anybody is able to do that, because I mean, like we said, these animals have billions of years of advantage against us, where they've been working on the problem a lot longer than we have. They've had a lot more tests and use cases, and they're way ahead of us. But there definitely is the ability to get, as we keep working, we're going to get closer and closer to being able to mimic what they're able to do. And the really interesting things out there. I was watching a video the other day, really fascinating. Micro robotics are super cool. And that goes into these people that are trying to mimic bugs. And it's really cool because there's basically these tiny, tiny quarter-sized like quadcopters.
Right.
But they're so robust where you can, drop them from 30 feet and it doesn't matter, because they're so small that they're going to hit and they're just going to bounce right back up like it's nothing. You can touch their propeller mid-flight for like over a second and they're not going to hit the ground. They're just going to go down a little bit and come right back up. So there's so many interesting things out there when you look into the biological world.
Yeah. It's like those who are studying how worms and snakes move so that it create those small ones, and then how you could then put them inside your body to get through all those, navigate all those small holes and vessels to, help you, get stuff out, like unwanted stuff out, stuff like that, right?
No, snakes are absolutely fascinating. I'm very interested in those. We have a professor at our university that also does that. He actually works pretty close with Dr. Mueller. They went to Brunei together a couple of years ago, and his whole research is he does a bunch of different animals, but one of his is flying snakes. So they were able to go out and do Brunei and study some of the flying snake species and how they glide and move.
Right. Interesting. Let's say if we manage to mimic the biological animal at 100%, can the design be improved further, or are the design of animal features already the most perfect or efficient for its purpose? That's a good question.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. It's really cool to think about if we could get to that 100% potential. Of course, we could go one step further. It's about getting to the 100% first. And it's also it's about the problem. It's about the use case. Maybe we don't need to get to 100%. Maybe we need to get to 100% on one thing from the animal, but not another. Maybe we can take multiple things together. Maybe we can take something from you see a lot of these really interesting species that, robots out there that they can do multiple things. Maybe it can walk like a spider, but then if it wants to, it can ball up its legs and roll around like a roly-poly. So, maybe you find it just really depends on your use case. But if you can get to 100% on the system, I don't see any reason that you can't improve further past that and create new features and new different things that you can think about for the robot.
Mm. What are the potential application of biomimetic bat sonar robots in various fields such as search and rescue, environmental monitoring, and infrastructure inspection?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of fields out there that you could use these robots for. Search and rescue is actually a pretty interesting idea for sure. When you look at the not with our bats, that's not something we've really explored too heavily with ours, but when you look at the field of just bio-inspired robotics in general, that's a huge part of it. I mean, there's snake robots that are able to, crawl under debris and go out there and look for people in an incident.
Yep.
I mean, those dog robots that we talked about initially, the spots, those are also used for those search and rescue missions. So there's a lot out there, and I'm sure that in some use cases, if the bat was efficient enough, you could definitely use it for that as well. Environmental monitoring, I'm not as familiar with. I'm sure there could be some aspects of that if you're able to use it to navigate around and maybe just keep monitoring on a forest. Maybe that's an application of this thing 50, 60 years down the line, once they're really working well and flying around and using sonar at the same time. There's definitely options, and I'm sure the same thing maybe goes with infrastructure inspection. I'm not as familiar with that field, but I'm sure there's a lot of applications for I know there's a lot of applications for acoustics where you could find some interesting stuff as well.
But you don't necessarily need to build a bad robot, right? I mean, like the research and the engineering work that you guys are developing, it can also be applied on what you call unmanned flying vehicles like drones right now these days, where technology is already there. You just plug in, let's say, the sonar aspect of it, and the a better deep learning sensing. But I'm sure they've already got it. But things like that, right?
Yeah, no, you definitely don't have to have a gliding bat. You could, of course, apply this on a quadcopter or anything of that sort. I have actually done a little bit of research on putting it on a unmanned ground vehicle and riding it around and trying to collect some data with that. So there's a lot of applications for once you have this sonar capabilities, what you can do with it. It doesn't even have to be on a vehicle. Maybe it is. Maybe we learn something from these bats, and you're able to pull so much information in the environment that maybe you can put it on. You just have like a little scanner that does it for you, and you go scan something. Maybe like with the infrastructure idea. I mean, this is nothing we've explored of, so I'm completely talking hypothetical, but maybe you can scan a building with that sonar and pull up some information about it. Maybe there's a crack, maybe there's something in it. So there's definitely a lot of interesting ideas with it comes to that.
How can deep learning and other AI techniques be further integrated in biomimetic bat sonar robots to enhance their performance and capabilities?
Yeah, so I've definitely talked to death a little bit the idea of the ear movements. So, well, I guess I haven't talked too much about that, but really, we're trying to mimic the ear movements. We're trying to figure out, if I twitch my ears like this, what do I get from the environment? If I do this, what do I get from the environment? Maybe you even, you have even more feedback coming in, where if the echo looks a certain way at first, I need to twitch my ears to this position. So you get this giant, game you're playing. And that's why we do like the idea of using reinforcement learning to play that game and find the best winning combination based on the environment you're getting. But there's even more than that. So you go to that flight side. That's a big thing we're trying to do, is being able to reconstruct those flights using machine learning, use computer vision to track the bats, understand how they're moving, and being able to bring it all together. So there's tons of applications for AI and machine learning in that field.
Can we use the bio-inspired technology to improve human features, like improve the human ears, like the bat's ear? Or maybe like the hearing aid. I think that's what. Right.
Yeah, no, there's tons of applications out there. There's definitely some really cool technologies going on with the idea of sonar vision, for blind people. Like, can we create something? I think I'm not super familiar in the field, and I would, don't take my word for it, but I think there's some really rudimentary technology with sonar where it's, maybe you have something that they wear where, oh, there's something in front of you, and it buzzes and tells you that there's something in
Right.
front of you, so don't walk into it or anything like that. So there's some really cool ideas out there. And when you do look into that field of what, like, trying to help
Mm.
blind individuals, that sonar is definitely an interesting option to work with
Mhm.
down the line, and understanding how other things might see.
I'm gonna play a little, uh, yeah, a little bit of being a devil's advocate here. I mean, all this are fine and well, and it contributes to the greater good. But just like anything else, it depends on how you're using it. I mean, like if you look at a knife, it can be you can use it well, for like cooking purposes in the kitchen, but it can also be used for harm. So what are the, like the danger to this advancement as you're going ahead with all this R&D work, that eventually it could be weaponized for,
Oh, I
yeah.
mean, yeah, of course that's out there. I mean, if you work in the engineering world, you understand that every
Mm,
single engineering design, the
can
military is
be.
going to try to use it as something, and it
Mm,
can be militarized and used into something. So there is always that
mm,
ethical concern about what you can do with it, and
mm,
there is always going to be that. And it's hard to deal. It's hard to really get away from that, because, like I said, everything in the engineering world is kind of being taken into that realm. I mean, we've talked all about AI.
mm,
That's a huge part of the military right now, is AI
yep.
use, and how do we better use it to achieve their goals.
Mm. How does the robot adapt to changes in its environment and unexpected situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're definitely not at that point yet where we're just releasing it and letting it go and seeing how it operates. We're a lot in the earlier stages of data collection and stuff like that, but that's where the reinforcement learning part goes in. It should, that the whole idea of reinforcement learning is it learns itself, it learns to adapt,
Mm,
it learns based on the environment. How do I behave? Maybe we can train it so it can understand the foliage around it. So maybe if it's in a certain kind of forest, it uses a different kind of echo, it uses a
mm,
different kind of pattern, because that foliage behaves better, you're able to detect more from it. Uninspected situations are also very interesting. We've done some work in the past
mm,
with gap detection. So
right.
can I detect where there's an opening in the forest? Because obviously that's where you want to go through. These bats are flying through all kinds of dense vegetation, and they're weaving and diving all through it and
Mm,
finding the paths. So there's a lot of interesting applications when it comes to that. And of course, if you're working with AI in general and that idea of learning, you're going to be trying to build something to expect the unknown. And that's equally the most interesting part of it, but that's also the most challenging part of it, where
mm,
you definitely can't do that with a model. You can't just write a model that
mm,
is able to learn on the fly and detect the unknown. But when
mm,
you're doing these reinforcement learning models, that is still your biggest issue. Autonomous vehicles are super interesting. I've done a little bit of messing with them and research on them, and their biggest issue is when something unexpected happens. What if I drive up and there's a construction zone? I wasn't expecting that. How do I behave? And that's the big issue you see with them right now as well.
mm. We've got a question. Have you been approached by the animal rights people to criticize your research on the bats, or to tell you to stop doing research on the bats?
Uh, no, not particularly.
Mm,
We have not had any sort of issue with that, to my knowledge. So,
mm,
luckily, we haven't had those issues. We, try to follow all the protocol that's given to us and what's written out by the individuals that are in charge of all this legislation. But of course, if you have any sort of animal based research, there is always going to be some concern. There is always going to
mm,
be some stuff out there, and there's always going to be people that are definitely against it for good reasons, of course. But
mm,
you have to understand what the cost benefit analysis is when it comes to these animal research, and you
mm.
have to do everything in your power, which I think we have done, to make sure that you are treating the animals in the best way possible when you're doing this research.
Right. What are some of the coolest um, research work in this field that you've ever heard of? Like, some researcher is studying this, very cool animal to, to tackle. a very cool problem or solution. And I've
Yeah,
got a
no, I
follow-up
mean,
question to that. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, there's oh my God, there's so much cool stuff out there. I mean, I'm a little biased with the bat stuff. I think that's
Mhm.
fantastic. I've talked about a lot of it. I love snake locomotion. I think it's super
Mm.
interesting how they move, their ability to just get into anywhere basically and move around. I mean,
Mm.
you'll find them in the weirdest spots. I found
Mm.
a snake skin in my staircase a year ago, so I know they've been climbing around in my house somehow. So they'll definitely get in the most interesting places. Like I said, the micro robotics where you're studying bugs, that's also super fascinating. And a really cool one I've seen too is seal whiskers, which
Seal whiskers. Mm.
yeah, so seal whiskers are super unique and it's kind of like the bats where they have eyes, of course, but they use the seal whiskers. They're super, super sensitive and they sense vibrations in the water. So you're
Mm.
able to use these whiskers to sense flow and
Mm.
detect where stuff's around. The same thing, you can basically blindfold the seal. And if there's a fish swimming in the water near it, it can detect it with just its whiskers and go out and attack it and get
Mm.
its food.
I know that the dogs and cats whiskers are already very, very
Yeah.
super cool and sensitive. Now to study seals whiskers in water, you've got the element of water, right? And
Yeah,
yeah,
no, it's
it's super.
super interesting.
Now, what's the craziest that you have ever heard of? Like someone studying some exotic animals, dangerous
Oh,
animals, and
yeah.
like the craziest ones.
Oh yeah, I mean, flying snakes is pretty crazy. I know the
Mm, yeah.
the people that
Yes,
work with them are, definitely have
you can outrun
interesting
them, right?
stories. Yeah, no, you can't. They're gliding out of the sky, so they're out there running around in the forests in Brunei trying to catch flying snakes. And I mean, props to them. I don't know how well I do in that situation. So there's some crazy stuff out there, but I mean, there's some really unique species in the
Mm,
world that people are trying to pull from. I've seen a lot of really cool stuff. Just there's a lot of cool stuff out there. I mean,
mm,
think of
mm,
an animal and somebody's probably out there studying it, trying to learn from it. And there's
mm.
so many species out there. So you're always going to find more and more interesting things.
So it sounds like there's actually a big community, a research community, doing this
Mhm.
already. It's just that in the maybe the normal world setting, we're just not hearing much of this, but instead we're hearing about other kind of like superficial hype, like like right now the whole chat gpt
Yeah,
ai, those kind of
of
hype. But
course.
like when the real cool stuff that's happening here in this field, like it's not deserving the attention that that it actually rightfully deserved. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think there's, you know, I think we're seeing the end goals of it in our life. I think we see the product that comes out, but we don't know where it came from. How
Mm.
many times do you use something day to day and you don't understand? I mean, needles are really interesting, and that a lot of the inspiration coming from them comes from bees,
Mm.
wasps,
Mm.
stingers, and there's some really cool research with that. But I mean, you talked about AI. AI is huge. AI at
Mm.
the end of the day is just bio inspiration. You're trying to mimic how a brain works. A neural network is a neural network. It's based on neurons.
Yep.
It's based on how they fire the pathways. So it's out there. It's just you don't see it as you
Mm.
don't understand it as much and see where it's coming from.
Mm. We've got we're actually yeah, running out of time now, but I think we could still make do with a few more questions. So do accidents happen during researching the animals, and what kind of accidents can potentially happen when you're doing such research, and what can we think of like in advance to prevent like a disaster usually.
Yeah, no, there's always the chance of accidents with anything you do, and so you just have to do everything in your power to minimize those risks and understand what risk you're taking, and that's where that legislation comes in, where you have to present to them, this is exactly what we're doing, this is how we're handling the situation, and this is what we're going to do to prevent as many accidents as possible.
Mm.
And I'm not super familiar with stuff that actually happens out there and what accidents have come up or may not have, but you definitely have to be weary of those. And that's why you got to send the right people out there to do the job. That's why we bring people in to get the animals and do a lot of the animal experimentation, uh, rather than throwing some underqualified engineers out there to catch bats and play with them and see what to do. We send actual biologists that know what they're doing and understand these species a lot more than we do.
Hmm. I would like to wrap up with two questions that I would like you to share to our general audience, especially if we've got, students or aspiring startup entrepreneurs who's thinking about the next cool idea, maybe, they're thinking about the next app to build, and this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because, there's just so much more out there than just writing an a machine algorithm. I'm like, you could,
Mhm.
explore in the world of bioinspiration engineering fields, right? Like, if you are to encourage someone to get started in your bioinspiration field,
Mhm.
what would you say to them? And to those startup founders who probably just folded their companies, they felt at creating like the next Facebook app, and they're sort of like searching for a problem to solve. What kind of message can you tell to such founders to try to get them to pay attention to this field, your field, and perhaps try to explore it? Yeah.
Yeah, getting started in the field, I mean, it's definitely not the hardest thing to do. It's, like I said, you can go out and find you there's the problem base and there's a solution base. You can find something in nature and decide, oh, that's really cool. What can I apply that to? Or you can, take a problem you have and go look to nature to figure out how to solve it. But really, the way to get into that is just to get more into, I guess, just the biology and the nature in general. Read about animals, watch nature documentaries, look at the papers, look at what's coming out, look at all the cool things that people are studying. Because I mean, some people are just studying the animals and seeing what they're
Mm,
doing. There's a lot
mm,
of labs that are doing that, and they're like, well, we don't have an application for it. We're just
mm,
studying it for the sake of science, for the sake of
mm,
research, because we're interested in it.
mm,
And see what's going on out there, see what's interesting. And I think that's the biggest thing. Find something that interests you. Find an animal that's really cool, that's doing something awesome, and try to figure out how you can use that and how that can improve your work.
mm. We've actually got one last question, so maybe I'll just ask this and then we'll wrap up.
Sure.
Is there any difference on the behavior of lab bats compared to wild bats? Does lab bats have potential to disrupt and threaten to wildlife bats and their natural environment?
Yeah, no, on the second part, that goes back into all the protocols and doing everything we can to not interrupt that. That's why we've tried to become as least invasive as possible. We have the whole catch and release idea now of
Mm,
we take them, do the experiments, and then send them back out there on their day. They're fine. They get back into the environment. They get right back to where they need to go. And as far as the difference between lab bats to wild bats, there's always going to be a difference there. There's that just that goes with anything. When you test your robot in your lab, even if it's not a bio-inspired robot, just a walking robot, which I guess is bio-inspired,
mm,
but you test it in your lab, it's going to behave different than if you take it out in the wild. There's always going to
mm,
be something new you're going to run into, new
mm,
challenge, something unexpected. So you have to be noticed of that. And the same thing is going to go with these animals. They are going to behave better, or they're going to behave different in the lab than they are out in the wild. And that's why we try to improve our techniques more and more to
mm,
make it as least invasive as possible, to the point where I know we're even moving towards trying to put these arrays out in the wild, so the bats
mm.
will just fly through them, and they're hanging out in the forest and they'll just fly through it rather than even having to take them into the lab in the first place.
Right. Adam, that was fun. I've learned a lot myself, like you inspired me so much that maybe one of these new things that I might do in the future would be, very inspired stuff. So getting more into hardware, yeah, rather than just stick to software. So thank you for your time. I know it's late right now over at your end. So again, we appreciate you taking your time to tell us all about this and share about your work. If we've got people in the crowd, in the audience, who would like to get in touch with you or your team or Professor Rolf Miller to explore, research collaboration, how can they reach you?
Oh geez, I should have had it pulled up.
Mm.
So
No worries. If you
yeah,
want to pull
anything
it
you want to
up the
reach out to
slide,
us.
is
Yeah,
there a
I had
slide?
a
Yeah,
there
you
is
can
a
just
slide. I in
just
one of his
quickly put
slide
it up.
decks
We
he
can,
sent me.
yeah.
But anything you want to reach out, we're the Bio-Inspired Science and Technology Lab at Virginia Tech. My professor's name's Rolf Mueller. It's spelled multiple ways. It depends on where you find it. So you're welcome to look him up and email one of us. I'm sure you can find his email online if you just look up Mueller, Virginia Tech, Rolf Mueller, Virginia Tech. My email's hinsane@vt.edu. I'm happy to talk to anybody. I think you also put my LinkedIn profile in one of the
Conference program
announcements as well.
Yep. So they can just click on your link, click on the conference program, click on your linked name, and then it will be transferred to the LinkedIn. Yep.
Yep. But
okay,
I can pull this up real quick.
Yep.
So you can see that. Yeah, these are some of his funneled slides. But yeah, he has this thing on the end. So if anybody wants that, which is the Twitter, the Instagram, whatever Mastodon is, I'm not super familiar, and Facebook for the lab. He's always on there posting interesting photos of animals and what they're doing in Brunei and what the team is currently working on over here.
Right. Awesome. So. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to have you with us. Take care now, and we'll speak again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you for asking me.
No worries. Bye.
Goodbye.